Thanks. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for the questions that we got through the break. I just want to pick up and highlight a couple of points before going on to the next section, and it's really just emphasising things that were said during Andrew's lecture, and also some of the questions that came up, which is, if I just go back, yeah. Maybe if I just actually that equation there is probably enough. This is the important equation. So remember, right at the beginning, I said, like, observational data, conventional kind of statistical models, is like we step back from the world, we're observing the world. We say, well, if the world continues to evolve under the current conditions, then we can make statistical predictions about what will happen. Yeah, but what we would really like to know in most of healthcare is, how can I improve a situation? Yeah, how can I take somebody who's sick and make them well? Or how can I stop somebody getting potentially poorly? Yeah? And those questions are causal questions. I want to actively intervene. Now, on the face of it, you've got observational data from one world, and you want to ask questions about a different world, a world where I intervene. Those worlds are not linked. Yeah, you've got data from one system, you want to make statements about another system. The amazing thing about the foundations of causal inference is that this left-hand side is a world that you never get to see. Yeah, but that's the system you want. What I would like to know is what happens to the population if I treat them. Say the average outcome in the population if I give everybody this drug or vaccinate. Different to what happens on average in the population if I don't. You don't get to see this. But by making assumptions, you can link the interventional world that you never get to see with the observational world that you do get to see. Yeah, and that's the key, that's the kind of key concept, is that if we can make assumptions, we can link these two worlds, and we can estimate the thing on the left-hand side using statistical quantities from the observed world in the right-hand side. But we have to make assumptions. Okay. Right, back through. Are there any kind of questions that came up from further questions? Yes?
You show this theoretical explanation, and I was studied it a little bit, and as I remember, then you were trying to create this structure, these unknown, unmeasured things, knowledge that you show, represented as a factor, and one of the programs that the computer do not know what is it. So the computer knows that it influences on this and this. For example, there's coffee drinking and smoking. But there's a need of person who name this thing that influence these both things. And I think this might be the problem when people understand it's not correctly. The name this factor, unmeasured factor, unknown factor incorrectly.
I think, yeah.
There's no question, just I wanted to remark it, and maybe you have studied it, how correctly classify these unmeasured factors.
Yeah. Sorry, Andy.
You want to go ahead first?
No, you go.
Yeah, I guess this is also, I guess, a kind of tangential point to that, which is that, this phenomenon occurs where people sometimes just draw on unmeasured variables without really saying what they are. And it's basically to try and kind of generalize their analysis a bit. You say, well, even if we have these unmeasured variables, we don't know what they are. Even if they're there, we can still do this identification. So we can do things like fractal criteria and things like that. So they kind of label them on the graph, but they don't say exactly what they are. They say, well, they could be there. It's still okay if they are.
Yeah.
That's possibility. So something like this, we don't need to say that it's addictive behavior, it could be something else.
Yeah.
We just say, okay, as long as this is the graph, even if, it could be addictive behavior, it could be something else, we can still use the backdoor criteria and say we can estimate the effect from coffee on caffeine.
But the thing you never know, and this is the controversy, is that there's not another grey U that's pointing into coffee and pointing into cancer.
Yeah. In that case, we're in trouble.
Yeah, you're in trouble. Well, in that case, there's an indirect association which you'll pick up through that statistical analysis. So you'll run your statistical algorithms, and you'll say, I'm assuming that there's no unmeasured confounders. There's nothing out here which is on the backdoor path between T and Y that you haven't measured. And that's why causal inference was kind of out there, almost seen as a pseudoscience for many, many years. People said, well, you never know. I mean, there's a few arguments against that, and I was chatting with people over coffee. As Andrew pointed out, there's never been a randomised trial between smoking and cancer. But no one would dispute this arrow. And one of the reasons is because something called the causal gap, which is, having done this analysis, you will end up with an effect size between T and Y. Yeah? Having seen that effect size, you can ask a question: how big would the unmeasured confounder have to be to explain away that effect size? So that's one thing you can do, which is, and of course smoking and cancer is a huge effect. Yeah? So it would be remarkable if there was somehow an unmeasured confounder which was driving that statistical association, having adjusted for everything else that we know. So that's one thing that you can do. The other thing, which is more qualitative, which is this notion of triangulation, which is, if this really is a causal effect, it doesn't matter what conditions I view it under. By definition, that association will hold up. And so what people do will be, if they see an association in this experiment, do I see it in a completely different experiment? Do I see it in a completely different population, in a different environment? And if that persists, again, that's kind of qualitative information that there's probably a causal association. Okay. Good. Right. Causal analysis of observational data is hard. And there's two reasons it's hard, or challenging, let's say. Is that, first of all, not just because of the technical assumptions that we need to make, so the things that Andrew covered in his first foundation lecture. So we need to kind of make these assumptions for us to be able to link the observational world and use that to say something statistical about the interventional world. Because even if those assumptions hold, we have to be very careful not to introduce bias in the analysis of the data. Yeah? And so what that means is that if I've got an observational data set, electronic health records, and I want to do a causal analysis, you have to be careful in how you perform that causal analysis. And this is what I'll cover for the next half hour or so. Recently, Hanan and Robbins, I mean, it had been out there in the literature and people have been thinking about it, but this is the paper, this is in some sense the breakthrough paper, described an approach called target trial emulation as a kind of a workflow, qualitative approach to how to perform causal analysis of observational data. So this is not quantitative. It's not telling you, oh, this is how to build the statistical estimators. It's really giving you a kind of a workflow. Oh, do this, then do that, then do this. And the reason it's so powerful is that it's introduced to kind of stop you tripping up along the way. And the idea is fairly simple, and it goes back to things that Andrew said, which is what we're going to do when we're designing when we're looking at an observational study, or an observational analysis, we're going to think about the closest match in a randomized trial. It's going to be hypothetical. Yeah, but by hypothesizing or imagining a randomized trial, it's going to help us in the actual way we conduct the analysis. Now, the idea of designing observational studies that matched randomization studies goes back a long way back, that says, I'm going to undertake an observational study. How should I design it? How should I go and collect my data? Well, think about the randomized trial and then try and generate the observational data in a way that matches the randomized trial. But nowadays, in the world we are, there's a lot of found data, like electronic health records. You'll go into electronic health records. That's not data that you've set up to answer your question. That's data that's just out there. And there's more and more data out there. We know that the amount of data is doubling in the world every 2 years. So increasingly, what we want to do is go retrospectively, or go and pick out data which we haven't designed, and use that for our causal analysis. And this is where this approach is most useful. So in a target trial emulation, the analyst is required to frame their causal question by specifying the protocol of a pragmatic target trial that's designed to match the observational study. So if you're a medical statistician working in randomized trials, you will know very much. In fact, a lot of your time will be spent specifying the protocol of an RCT. And the reason for that is, for you to get approval for a randomized control trial, you have to submit not only your study design, but also your something called a SAP, the statistical analysis plan, that says how you will collect the data, what you will measure, and then how you run your analysis. And the reason why, like the FDA in the US, the MHRA, or the European Medicines Agencies are so particular about this is that everything is pre-specified. You pre-specify the data, you pre-specify the analysis. And that prevents you kind of double dipping. Or p-hacking, as they call it. I go in, I looked at the data from this angle, didn't like it, and it's not likely to get published. If I look at it that way, we'll look at it this way or that way.
This is called data analysis.
So there's a famous quote, isn't it, that says, if you torture the data enough, it'll confess to anything. So you have to be careful, and this avoids torturing the data. You pre-specify your analysis, and so the idea about writing down a protocol for your causal data analysis, as if it was a randomized trial, and then reporting that, is a really interesting and really powerful approach. And there's even moved now for like some of the big journals to look at pre-specification. You would pre-specify your analysis plan, pre-submit it to journals before you actually do the analysis. Okay, and so here's an example of this approach in action by some very eminent epidemiologists, and this is an example from Israel, looking at the COVID vaccine, Pfizer vaccine uptake. It's a large.
The minor common run bodies that the last author will join us for a panel on the last day.
Fantastic. So this is a great example of where of using a causal analysis on purely observational data in order to make very kind of important policy decisions. And a policy decision is a causal question. If we change the policy, we're going to intervene on the world. What we would like to know is what might change. So the large sample size allows the researchers to estimate the vaccine effectiveness in subpopulations. This again picks up on a point that was raised at the coffee break, is why one of the reasons why causal analysis is kind of on the uptake is this point that if I need to stratify on X, yeah, on potential confounders at a fine enough resolution that when I look into this little bucket, yeah, the data almost looks random. The allocation of the treatment looks random. So if I say, oh, you know, I want to stratify it on age, take patients over 60, then look at preconditions, do they have diabetes or not? And as I subdivide and subdivide, I'm trying to find these strata where it looks like the patients that took paracetamol or didn't take paracetamol or took the intervention or didn't have the intervention, they look random. Because at that part, you have almost like these sets of little randomized trials, and then I can combine them back up. Yeah. But of course, with lots of potential confounders, you've got lots of strata. But one of the great things nowadays, as we move into a world of electronic health records and wearables, the ability to measure is becoming very cheap. So our sample sizes are getting very large, which means that we can do more granular resolution, which again I think is one of the drivers in the uptake of causal analysis.
Can I ask a quick question? The amusing thing is that Noah and Noam at the time were my postdocs. When they wrote that, it was a virtual postdoc because of COVID. They were stuck in Israel. But is this really? And I just saw Miguel last night. So is this really causal reasoning in the sense of trying to understand causality versus just what you described, really careful matching?
Yeah. Well, so that's a great question. If you match to the point where the only difference between me and you who are matched is that you took the treatment and I didn't,
right,
then I can ascribe that to a causal effect. Because I've kind of created my twin.
Yep.
You and I are twins in the world, and the only difference between us is that you took the vaccine and I didn't. So I can then compare the outcomes.
So it's more in the sense of Miguel's original paper about trying to recreate sort of thinking of what would it take like to recreate a trial with observational data, as opposed to a more Pearl-like, let's create the DAG.
Yeah. Yes, although what Pearl would say is that he would try and find the mathematical functional relationship between the treatment and the outcome. But ultimately, it comes down to matching. Now you can match at an individual level. You've taken the treatment, find everybody like you, say all the things that we think might affect whether you took the treatment or not and the outcome. Yeah, and create a little cluster around you of people who didn't take it.
There is a great example in the UK with pregnancy in the vaccine.
I'm sorry, did you say?
And in the UK, they didn't, initially in Pfizer experiments, they didn't test the vaccine for pregnancy.
That's right, yes.
And in the UK, they started spreading the vaccines, and a lot of women got vaccinated and didn't know they were pregnant. And as the time went along, they could test the effect of the vaccine on pregnancy women with a randomized trial.
Yes.
They didn't know it, and see if it's safe or not. So as the time went on, it was safer to use later on in the pregnancy.
Yeah, right. Great point.
And
So
that's
this is
how that
another.
came from the FDA.
This is another example where nature helps you, where there's these natural experiments that occur in the data. So where nature doesn't help you, you have to create these natural experiments either by matching or by finding strata that look as if they're randomized. Yeah. Or in econometrics and in public policy, there's something called synthetic controls, which is a really popular method which says, I want to know what's going to happen to you. Like in public policy, we're often interested in, say within a local government authority, what would happen if I introduce a sugar tax? Then it's kind of hard to think about that, the superpopulation. Oh, what is the population? I then have to think about what's the repeatable units. Oh, I have to imagine a randomized trial on local authorities. That doesn't quite. So what people have come up with is synthetic controls, which is I'm going to make like a digital twin of you, which is I'm going to collect all the other data and I'm going to make a hypothetical you, by combining information, and then I'm going to model the hypothetical you who didn't take the treatment versus you that did, and look at the difference. But ultimately, we have to find ways of matching or finding strata. But the important thing from this study is that for a medical statistician, who had worked on randomized control trials, or works on randomized control trials, these would be standard boxes that they would have to fill in for their submission to FDA or European Medicines Agency. So first of all, if you were doing a randomized trial, you would say something about the population. And that would be by the eligibility criteria. So for here we have that these were for individuals aged over 16 without previous vaccination, etc., etc. You'd also have to be very clear about what the treatment strategy was. So here we're comparing one dose of the vaccine at baseline and one dose 3 weeks later versus no vaccination. What was the assignment? What was the assignment mechanism of this treatment to this population? And so you can see this one is particularly important, which is in longitudinal analysis, what constitutes time zero? And this is a major tripwire, when you come to do, like in epidemiology, or if you want to do causal analysis, is that you have to be very careful about when does the intervention, when do we think about the intervention as occurring, and how long do we follow up? What precisely is the outcome that we're going to measure? And what is the statistical estimand or the population estimand that we're targeting? Now, in an RCT, in a randomized control trial, these would be in a standard protocol that you would write up. But what people had noticed in causal analysis, I think the great influence of Hernan and Robbins is that if I just give you the data, if I gave you that data and asked you, was there an effect? You're eager young data scientists, you just dive straight in there, you start modeling it, and then you think of causal graphs and you do the analysis. But the problem is you may be making decisions along the way, which when you end up with the answer, you're never quite sure how you came to that particular choice of model, that particular choice of the estimand that you were doing. So the importance here is to really lay out that pre-specification in a very precise manner.
Are we sure that this happened freely? Not. This is rational reconstruction or real?
Well, you'd have to ask the authors.
Okay.
Hi.
In randomized trial, there also like the placebo effect. And is that captured by this model?
Yes, in terms of you would have to be looking at precisely what you mean by the assignment to the outcome, and so the assignment could involve a placebo effect if it was not double-blinded. Exactly. So when we think about the emulation part, we would think about the following closest matching the randomized trial. And then the analysis of the observational data must match the RCT protocol as closely as possible. If I might say that in some sense, the missing part of the target trial emulation is that having done all of this, so what the target trial emulation, the paper does, is a qualitative workflow analysis. It tells you how to proceed. Follow these steps very carefully. Is that the key variables and analysis objectives are pre-specified. That's really important for improving reproducibility and transparency of the analysis. But at the end of the day, having thought about this hypothetical randomized control trial, the analysis follows standard approaches. You would turn to a Rubin causal model, or you would turn to your DAG, and you would estimate, you would perform your causal analysis in that following way. And in recent work with Andrew and colleagues, what we've shown is that formally you can run all of your analysis within a target trial emulation through simulation. So having defined the closest matching randomized trial to your observational data, what we've shown is that actually you can just then simulate the randomized trial. And if you simulate the hypothetical randomized trial, by simulating that hypothetical randomized trial, you obtain a statistical estimate for the causal effect. Now, it's important to note that thinking about simulating a randomized control trial will not allow you to answer certain levels of causal inference, i.e. individual causal effects. So I might ask the question, what would have happened to you if you hadn't taken the paracetamol? Yeah? You will never get to see that in a randomized control trial because every individual is assigned to, say, a 2-arm trial, the treatment or not. And Judea-Pearl makes this very clear that there are kind of 2 distinct classes of problems in causal inference. One is about predicting the effects of interventions. Yeah? What would happen if we put people onto this particular treatment? And the other is about reasoning about counterfactuals. Now, a counterfactual is the outcome that would have occurred if you'd taken a different action. By definition, you will never see the counterfactual. But you might want to reason about it, in particular in legal cases. We might well argue what would have occurred if this subject hadn't taken this particular action.
Based on the knowledge we have after they took the action.
Yes, it's counterfactual.
Yeah, no, but
Yeah.
a priori it's the 2 things coincide, but once you do an action and you see that the patient, for example, died,
Yes.
then you can reason about it and say no.
Exactly, yes.
So
Yeah.
that's why I'm...
Yeah. So it's based on all available information that Rubin, the question mark in the Rubin causal model, when I take an action, I reveal one window, the other one remains closed. The question is, what was behind that window? Yeah, at the individual level. Yeah, a randomized trial will not answer that question, but it will allow you to answer questions about the population level differences. Most medical applications are on the effects of interventions. Yeah. And what we show is that this a simulation-based framework allows you to answer the first class of problems. We're not going to answer the second type of problem. But what we argue is that you can answer the first type of problem in perhaps a simpler way than the usual framework for causal inference. So just to kind of characterize what we talked about in terms of those different levels of causal analysis, the first level, and this is from Judea-Pearl, is 3 rungs of causality, is the first level is statistical association. So that's where you're sitting above the world, you're viewing the world, you're not going to make any changes, but you can make predictions. You can assess associations. What does a symptom tell me about the likely outcome of disease? If you want to intervene, I want to introduce a new policy, recommend a new drug, change an intervention, then what we want to do is to be able to kind of predict outcomes, for the future. We can tackle that used in statistical methods. The final part, which is at the Julia Pearl's third rung, which is about what would happen to you. What would happen to me if I changed my actions? Yeah, and that for this level you need counterfactuals by definition, because I'm talking at, for me, at the individual level. Now, if you're FDA or MHRA or European Medicines Agency, the only evidence you will ever get is at rung 2. Yeah, you never get data or evidence at rung 3. So what we're going to do is restrict ourselves to rung 2. Yeah, or to put it another way, we'll only restrict ourselves to asking questions where a population level randomized control trial would provide the answer. Hi.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Just even quite follow why we cannot narrow it down to counterfactuals. Maybe it's not a proper counterfactual, but if you have a process in which you stratify the population so much that you have kind of a stratum in which you have people that are very similar to a particular patient, for example, can't you, even if it's not a proper counterfactual that is narrowing down just to one patient, can't you just infer something from these small group of patients that are assigned to the same stratum?
It's a really great question. I'm going to rapidly flick back to.
Can I make a point?
Yeah.
So the idea of saying these people are similar is exactly what we're doing, right? Because we're kind of saying, well, if you're similar, we're basically predicting people that are similar to you. It's not you, it's just similar to you. So that's what we can do here. But it's not exactly, it's not you precisely, it's just people similar to you. So I think exactly the symmetry of
This is it. So this graph here is that you're going to be this green dot. Yeah? And what that means, I'll actually make you a bit more interesting. Let's make you the red dot here. Yeah? What this means is that you really have an outcome under the treatment, under taking paracetamol and not taking paracetamol. So this axis is your outcome on taking paracetamol. This axis is your outcome on not taking paracetamol, and this exists. Now, if I want to go to rung 3, I want to put your point on this graph. And I can tell you what would have happened. Actually, you did take paracetamol, so I project your point onto this axis and I read it off as a datum. If I want to make a counterfactual question, what would have happened if you hadn't? I have to take your dot and project it onto here. You never see that. But what I can ask statistically is say, populations of people like you, if I match, if I find strata, I only ever get to see the marginals, those two populations. And so I can't answer those questions at the individual level, but I can answer. Yeah. And essentially, I'm aware I'm going to run out of time, is what we're going to argue, or what we're going to show, is that we can build computer models that simulate these outcomes under a randomized control trial, given data from an observational study.
So just to say that I'm with you, because I'm not sure, what you're saying is that the counterfactuals do not make the assumption you make about how the whole world looks like and what the distribution, and it's a different approach, but at the end it leads you to the same type of result, because you ask yourself what would have happened had the person had the other intervention.
What we say is, so suppose you really did run a population scale randomized trial. So let's say I'm interested in the causal effect of smoking on lung cancer. Well, there is a randomized trial. What we could do, or on pregnancy, what's the effect of childhood birth weight, of smoking on birth weight of a child? So I come along and say, oh, well, I can tell you about what we can do is we can take the population of Israel, we take the mothers, expectant mothers, we randomise, half of them have to smoke, throughout pregnancy, and others are not allowed to smoke. Yeah, and then we look at the birth, and somebody might point out that's deeply unethical. Yeah, so you can't do that, but we would like to answer the question. Now, what would you be able to answer using that randomized trial? You wouldn't be able to answer any questions about an individual mother or child. What would have been their birth weight if the mother hadn't smoked? But what the randomized trial would allow you to ask is, are there systematic differences in the population? So it allows you to answer questions about statistics of populations, but not individual. But counterfactuals, the specific individuals are unscientific in a Popperian, in a Popper sense of they're non-falsifiable.
May I make a suggestion? I think the counterfactual opens a whole kind of world, and maybe, since we are not going to talk about counterfactuals, maybe we should.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
Leave that to the break.
It's been a fascinating kind of discussion, I think, on.
No, it's super important and fascinating. Just it's
yeah, for interest of time and sanity, I think we should move on. So what we're going to do is we're only going to be basically restricting ourselves to the second level. Let's take the simplest possible canonical setup. Is that we have a treatment that we care about, T, we have an outcome that we care about, Y, and we have a set of potential confounders, pre-treatment covariates, X. What we're interested in is the causal effect of the treatment on the outcome. We're going to treat this as a missing data problem in a slightly different way to the Rubin causal model. And I think the way we're going to treat this clearly indicates why we're not going to answer individual counterfactual level questions. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take the observational data that you have and we're going to simulate a randomized control trial. Yeah? And we're going to simulate that at massive scale because the only thing that's stopping us is our computer. Yeah? So I don't have to simulate 100 patients on my randomized control trial. I can simulate 1 million patients. Because even though for ethical reasons or many other reasons you might not have performed that randomized control trial, if we could accurately simulate it, then we're able to pick off any scientifically estimatable causal question of interest. So following which any causal quantity of interest can be read off, and we do not need to introduce counterfactuals in order to answer those questions, in just the same way that most medical statisticians working on randomized control trials do not think in counterfactuals. Yeah? If you're working in RCTs, you don't think in terms of counterfactuals, but you know that you're working on causal effects. Okay. So in a accompanying paper that we link at the end, we developed an axiomatic causal framework without the need to introduce counterfactuals if you're willing to restrict inference at rung 2. And simply speaking, we have a joint probability model for the observational regime. This is the data that you're going to have. This is the data that's within your electronic health records. Yeah? This is what we would have liked to have seen data from, but we don't. Yeah? And this is the probability distribution from a closest matching randomized trial. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a computer model here that, as best we can, is the closest matching model to what we've got, the data that what we've got. So we'd like data from the experimental world, but we don't have it for many reasons. We have data from the observational world. So what's the solution? We're going to build a predictive probabilistic model for the data that we don't have, but wish we did, using the data that we do have. And because it's a simulation tool, we can make this randomized control trial, this hypothetical trial, as big as we want. So we're going to simulate the population. Yes.
I think I'm missing something. have an associative model. We want a causal model.
Yeah,
So we build the associative model to create the data for the causal model.
yeah.
How, I think something is missing here.
So this is what we're going to do in the next couple of slides. You're absolutely right. We have an observational model. I can build this.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
regular machine learning, regular statistics.
Exactly.
And that's the problem
Yeah.
we're trying to solve.
What we're going to do is show is how can I move from this model to this model. And what we're going to see is we're going to break open this model and show how I can take this model and make this model. Yeah, and it's going to relate to things that we know well, like transportability of predictive models. Yeah, and what effectively it says is, if I build a model using data from population A, and I use it to predict a different population under different conditions, yeah, what are the constraints that I need on transportability? If I came to you, forget about causal inference, and I say, oh, I've got data on the Israeli population from this, say, demographics. What I want to do is predict people in the UK with different demographics. You would say, well, that sounds challenging because I've got data from population A and I want to predict on population B. In order to do that, I'm going to need some assumptions. Transferability of the model, certain conditions. Yeah? Those conditions match directly onto the causal assumptions that we've previously seen, as we will see. So under the Rubin causal model, we had this idea of the individual counterfactual. The question mark was, this person took the aspirin, I got to see the outcome under the aspirin, what would have happened if I didn't have the aspirin? That's the Rubin causal missing data. What we're going to do is look at this data table, which is full of missings. This data table says I've got an observational study of size n. There's no counterfactuals, there's just the allocation of the treatment and the outcome. And I want to use this data table to fill out this data table. And in that data table there's nothing there. Yeah? Or everything's missing. Yeah? This is the data that you would get under a randomized trial. Yes?
How do you perform evaluation for this kind of analysis?
In exactly the same way that you would perform the evaluation for the causal. So you might say to me, well, hopefully you would, how can I trust? I've built a predictive model using, I've got data from one world and I need to build a predictive model for a different world. How can I trust that predictive model? I would say it's exactly the same conditions for the causal inference, is that if you've measured all of the predictive variables that have the same, and the outcome model is transferable, then you're allowed to do that. And then you'll be able to answer causal questions. Yeah.
Maybe I can understand something that in the core of this, because in medicine, the great advantage of RCD that you are almost, if you are certain that the groups are randomly assigned to you. You have no such ability to be certain in observation.
That's right. Absolutely right. That here, the problem is that the randomized trial, I flip a coin. But here, there was no coin toss. I chose to take the aspirin. You didn't choose.
And you can't model it fully with X.
Maybe we should see the construction and then,
Yeah.
because
You have both X. The thing is that you will never have the X. It's no, but in the real world program, you will never have the full X. The question is, how can you adjust for that?
So, that point that he says, if I do this, I never have the full X, is exactly the assumption that we saw in Andrew's point about unconfoundedness, about ignorability. Yeah. If I'm going to ask you to accurately build a model for a randomized trial from observational data, you will have to make an assumption that I have all the predictors in X, yeah, or all the confounders. And if you don't, this model is going to be misspecified. But that maps directly onto the assumptions that are made in the causal inference about ignorability.
Only one template. That's the problem. There is some uncertainty.
There's always, exactly.
The question is, does the model models that? Doesn't create some uncertainty in that part?
So at the end of the day, you're going to have a model and you're going to have some assumptions. And then it's down to you and your scientific collaborators and your data scientists to sit down and say, are those assumptions reasonable? How could we explain away the effect that we see? Are there other explanations? Does the effect hold up across multiple environments? And at that point, you might make a tentative rejection of a null hypothesis that say the treatment had no effect. On that tentative rejection, you would want to do further follow-up in the whole scientific iteration of experimentation, hypothesis refinement. What we're going to do is build a predictive model for an RCT to give us a tentative suggestion of a treatment effect, and then for you as scientists to say, what would that mean? How can I follow that up? I'm going to have, for interest of time, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So what I want is a predictive distribution from the randomized trial given the data that I've got. Sorry, what I want is a predictive distribution for the randomized trial given the data, all the data that I have, being aware that that data is from an observational trial. And to do that prediction, this is a joint prediction. That's really important. We're going to have to predict a population. We're going to factorize that simply using something called the chain rule, which says any joint distribution can be broken down into a series of factors. So to build our randomized trial, what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, given the observational data, we're going to draw our first individual for the randomized trial. So I've got, say, the population of Israel, or a subpopulation. I'm going to generate a synthetic new individual, and I'm going to pop them into my trial, randomized trial. I'm going to toss a coin for the treatment. I'm going to predict their outcome, and then I'm going to put them back in to the trial. And then I'm going to toss a coin. I'm going to make another prediction. And it's this important point about we're going to continue to predict and then condition on our predictions. So we're going to generate synthetic data, and we're going to feed the synthetic data back into the model. And the reason for doing that is that if you do it that way, you'll get a joint prediction. So the idea here is we need a joint prediction over the population. This joint distribution that we have over covariates, treatment and outcomes can factorize in the following way. We have a model for the outcome given the treatment and the covariate. That's a predictive model that says what would be the outcome for this individual given this treatment and these covariates. So the first thing we're going to need when we're modeling across these two worlds is stability in this. We're saying that if you were randomized or if you chose to take the treatment, it doesn't affect the predicted distribution for the outcome. The second thing that we're going to need is we're going to need a model for the population of individuals. And then the final thing, which we know we can construct this thing by definition, is that the allocation of treatments are just going to be randomized.
But do you assume independency between the treatment and the covariates when you use this factorization?
No.
No, but the ability to transfer is essentially the assumption we started with. I don't remember the name we gave it, that assumed that Y0 and Y1 were not predictive about T.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this here is just a straightforward factorization of this joint distribution that says we're going to factorize this joint distribution into a a model of pre-treatment covariates. So what does the population look like for which we want to put this treatment into? Because we're going to simulate a randomized trial, we know what this is. This is a coin toss. Yeah, and then we're left with this thing here, which is our predicted model.
But this is after training on observations.
Exactly. Yeah.
Those observations are skewed, and the T and X are dependent in the observed regime.
Yes. So the T and the X exactly could be dependent, but the predictive is the same. Yeah. So it says if I've got an X, a particular age, if you were treated or not, the outcome, the statistical predictive, doesn't change whether it happened to be sitting in an RCT and being randomized onto paracetamol or not, or whether you chose to take paracetamol or not. The effect of the paracetamol is unchanged. And that's this transportability. That's one of the transportability criteria that says, given that you are allocated to a particular treatment and you have particular covariates, the uncertainty on the outcome is the same if you were in a randomized trial as if you were in the observational data. The following kind of recipe is just a way of simulating from this thing. And what will come in when we come to do the the illustration later, we're going to use things called bootstraps, which says if I have a population and I want to draw from this, I'm just going to grab you at random, grab somebody at random, duplicate them, toss a coin for what their outcome was going to be, predict their outcome, but really importantly, we're going to put that synthetic observation back into the data. And we're going to run it again. So we're actually going to be updating our predictive models on synthetic data as we go through.
Because if you weren't to update, then essentially we're back to what we learned from.
If we weren't to update, and I run this forward and generate a massive randomized control trial, I would get no uncertainty in the estimate of the treatment effect. Because suppose your prediction model here, after n observations, say the average treatment effect was 0.5 on the outcome, is that if I keep generating IID data from this predictive model, I'll end up with a treatment effect that has no uncertainty. Because I'll generate a population of 1 billion, and then you'll say, right, what's the average treatment effect on 1 billion people? That's what that value is. Right, now rerun it. Simulate me another randomized trial, and you'll get exactly the same result. Because I'm generating IID data, and if I repeat this simulation of the randomized trial over and over again, I'll get exactly the same result. There'll be no statistical uncertainty. What's interesting is that if I generate a datum, one row in this table, and then update my model with that synthetic data, and generate another sample, and then if I keep this recursive generate a datum, update, generate a datum, I run this randomized trial, I pick off the treatment effect, I then repeat the simulation, I'll get another treatment effect. I'll get a distribution on the treatment effects that will quantify the uncertainty in the population scale treatment effect.
Some notion of stationarity of this, we need to like throw out the first K samples.
Not in this part. There's an assumption of like stationarity in how you build the predictive model.
Yes.
Or exchangeability in the predictive model. Yeah. It's a subtle point because it says if I really had this data table, I would know what to do. I would just pick off my treatment effect and then I'd be done. So it's the uncertainty in this population scale RCT that we're going to try and estimate. So I'm going to ask you to fill out this. And if any of you have dealt with missing data before, what you could ask is, how do people cope with missing data? They do it by imputation. And you wouldn't ever do just one imputation. Because if I just do a single draw of an imputation and then read off my value, that won't take into account the uncertainty. So here we're going to have to generate repeated data tables. I'm just aware of the time. How do we...
So our plan, and we updated also the lunch, because we all go together to a lunch. And we finish at 12:30, take an hour and a half break, and then you have another half an hour to finish. So we keep the 3 hours we planned for the whole session.
Okay.
If it makes sense to you, then we finish at 12:30 and...
Yeah, I think I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly, because I think you need to kind of get your hands dirty on it to fully... I'll probably finish here, which just says... the key part here of what we're proposing is that you have data from this world. That's the observational world, where you have confounders. Yeah, and the confounders are, you want to know what's the effect of treatment on outcome. But the problem is that there's an association between the X and the T and the Y. And in the foundational lecture that Andrew gave, we asked the question, how can we reason about this world? This is the data you would like to have. I'd like to have, this is data from a randomized trial. The treatment and the covariates are independent by design. Yeah? And so what Andrew showed is that if you build enough strata, if you go down at a fine enough level of granularity, or if you match, your data looks like this. Yeah, the allocation of the treatment chosen by the individual at this level of granularity is independent. Yeah. What we're suggesting is that this is the data that you've got. That's the data that you would like. Yeah. Build a predictive model. You've got data from population A. What I want is data from population B. If you can simulate that, and quite rightly, the person at the back said, "Well, hold on a second. You know, if I hadn't mentioned causal inference, if I just walked in today and I'd said, right, we're just building predictive models. I've given you data from this, and I want you to predict the data from that." You'd say, "Well, I can't do that without assumptions." And the assumptions that you need in order to be able to transport predictive models are exactly the same assumptions that you need for causal inference. And that's what we're going to see. So I guess the take-home message is target trial emulation, Hanan and Robbins, is a really useful approach for thinking qualitatively about how to set up a causal analysis. Think very carefully about what's the eligibility criteria. What is the population that you're making your causal statement about? Yeah, how is treatment? What is the treatment? Yeah, how is that precisely defined? How is the assignment made in the observational data? And what we're saying is you can go one step further, which says, having written down that protocol, yeah, in order to do causal inference, you can just take a predictive model at a population scale randomized trial. And if you can do that, and you trust that, then you can read off causal estimates. If you don't trust this, you should be suspicious. Yeah. It's because you don't trust it's because of always that we have these potential assumptions that we have to make. And as Judea Pearl says, if you're going to do causal analysis, you have to make assumptions that lie outside of the data. Or as Jamie Robbins says, if you're going to pull a rabbit out of a hat, you have to put the rabbit in. Yeah. You have to make causal assumptions. if you're going to do causal analysis. And so in the practical experiment, we're going to be doing exactly this. We're going to take some data and show how you can simulate randomized control trials and therefore do causal analysis. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Can you think of this intuitively as some sort of abstract matching at the population level? So you're trying to find a matching population rather than matching individuals?
Yeah,
matching distribution.
Yeah. The key thing about the randomized trial is that your populations, suppose T is binary, your populations are balanced, they're matched by design, on average. Because I've broken that link, by definition, because I've tossed a coin, so to speak, there is no association between X and T, because I tossed the coin. There's no association between anything, between any individual and any other because of that. And so here we obtain balance in those two populations. The observational world, you don't have balance. And so that's why you need to either go down to strata or you need to match. There's another approach called inverse propensity weighting that we didn't go into, but it's a way of trying to construct balanced populations across, such that the only thing that differs at some level between the treated and the untreated, between the people, the outcomes is whether they were treated or not. I didn't answer your question, did I?
Never mind. I'll ask you.
So it's, I guess what we're saying is that in the world that we live, yeah, what is the gold standard of evidence that we could obtain for a causal effect? Yeah, the gold standard evidence would be a randomized trial at the population scale. You can't do any better, yeah, without entering into philosophy or cocktail conversations, as Don Rubin calls them. Yeah. It's conversations to be had over cocktails rather than science. So the best we could ever possibly do is a possibly completely unethical randomized controlled trial. Well, what we're saying is that if that's the gold standard evidence, let's simulate it. Let's simulate a synthetic randomized controlled trial, given the data that we've got. And then let's look at that analysis, the predictive analysis, and that will answer our causal question.
That step, I think everybody agrees, is clear. The thing that where we get lost is where in the simulation you have guarantees. I mean, the idea of let's simulate a random control trial, it's very clear and very clean. But what I think, at least I personally get don't get very is where do you get the probabilities for the simulation? Because the model you show here, if I was treating it as a Bayesian network, I would say the probability of y given x and t is the same in both models.
Yeah.
And so if I can estimate it, I can simulate from the experimental model directly.
Yeah.
But this is not what you're doing. You're doing something more complicated.
So you're absolutely right that if I gave you this graph and this probability distribution, to simulate this is fairly easy. Yeah. But you have to assume that. Yeah. Now, the assumption that goes from the left to the right is the following: is that, and apologies, this won't be very big because I've only got this much.
We can turn off the projection and see the whole thing, but I don't know if it's worth it.
Let's see. Is that if I had this graph that I have here? Oh, sorry. So going from this side to this side is fairly trivial. And remember, what I'm trying to get at is this factorization. So I've got this data. So in order to simulate, I pressed that by mistake. in order to simulate this thing, what do I have to do? I need to generate x. Well, I can do this. I'm going to generate t at random, independent of x. That's the whole point. That's the randomized trial. And then I'm going to generate my outcome given those two things. And we can do that. In which case, I can interpret this as a causal effect. The problem is that if unknown, I have an unmeasured confounder u, which goes into here, which is associated with the treatment and the outcome. When I come to simulate this, I'll simulate my x. I can do that because I've observed this. I randomize my treatment because I just toss a coin. But when I come to predict, in this world, I'll get it wrong. And the reason the predictions will be wrong is that the association between u and y and u and t will get mopped up into my prediction. And that's the assumption that we need to make. But this doesn't mention counterfactuals. This is purely an assumption about taking data from one world, a probabilistic model from one world, and using it to make predictions or simulations in another world. So in order for that to be transportable, you have to assume that there's no u. And that's the assumption that Andrew says that's normally wrapped up in the world, in the tale of counterfactuals. For us, there's no counterfactuals. It's just purely a question of when can I build an accurate predictive model for this world, given that.
I'm trying to separate the question of the assumption. The assumptions here are that essentially when you say there's no u, it means that that x separates t from y. The other assumption, the other issue is transferring the condition probability, and the third issue is the fact that we're working in a limited data world, and so we don't actually have the condition probability. We have samples from it, and how does that affect things? And I'm not sure I understand the first one because you were very clear about it. I don't understand the last one, whether it plays a role in the simulation or it has nothing to do with the simulation.
So it will play a role in the simulation. When we come to do this, we're going to construct our randomized control. We need a model for the x. And we need to build that model using finite data. And so there's uncertainty that's going to come in there. And actually what we're going to suggest is you do something called a bootstrap in order to take the empirical distribution of x and build a generative model for that. This thing we know exactly what to do. That's a coin toss. And then the only last thing where we've got uncertainty is over the predictive. This is just a predictive, like regression type model. Now we can take uncertainty.
You must generalize because usually you will not see all the possible. You cannot
exactly.
use the empirical distribution.
Exactly. So for there, you either have to build a rich class of regression models and make assumptions that you have this as true, or do model uncertainty and test for accuracy there. Other questions? Yes.
You could get, instead of this simple causal graph, we'll take the example with the diabetes. You have an M that is observed, and you don't want to take into account. Because if you do, you add compounders. How would you act? How, like, you need to, would you just take out M out of X, and that's the solution, or you're doing something?
Precisely so. What you would do is you would ask the question, this is the question that we asked, is you need to build a faithful simulator for a randomized control trial. And so in order to do that, you would say you would need to think about how would I build an accurate prediction of outcome under the treatment assignment and under the under the covariates, such that this is what I'm aiming at
Yeah,
to do.
imagine inside X there's an M, right?
Yeah.
That goes back to two unobserved and in fact T and Y. Can you have M inside and build this so M doesn't affect T anymore, so you don't have that? Or you gotta identify all the M's in X that you need to extract out?
So if you have the collider, for example, then it would say, and Andrew, I'll just confirm with you, it would say that the data that you've collected in this world is not able to support you don't have the information needed to simulate a randomized trial.
That's in the butterfly.
Yeah, or the collider, yeah.
Like a slide before the butterfly, without M affecting directly, M was affected by 2U. In that question, you're not supposed to be confounding by M.
It's a good question.
Yeah, so that example, we have these kind of unmeasured variables, which are the shaded nodes. In that case, we'd have to do something slightly different to be able to identify the estimate. So instead of maybe predicting a randomized trial, we might have to predict maybe further observational data and then extract the information from that. So there are kind of subtleties that we've got missing data. So this is kind of a simple scenario, as Chris got in blue on the board. Basically, it's kind of, you observe all the relevant variables. That means you can predict everything because you have the forward distribution for X, T, and Y. Based on that, you can forward simulate your target trial as much as you want, and then you can pick off what you need. If you have unmeasured variables, then clearly you can't predict those variables. You haven't observed any samples from that trial distribution. You're going to have to do something a little bit different. But that's a slightly different aspect.
Yeah.
In this example, we are generating data and we are updating our table and doing it recursively, but when should we stop generating?
That's it. Yeah, again, that's a really good question. Is that I said you kind of keep going. So if I keep going, so this idea that I want to get a joint prediction. Now, if you can write down a joint model, you can just you can solve it exactly. But often you won't be able to write down a joint distribution at the population scale. So this idea that you simulate one datum and then you update your model using the synthetic data, and if I keep doing that by the chain rule, I'll construct a joint density. When would you stop? Is by monitoring the estimate of the treatment effect as you go down. So what you'll find is I'm interested in the treatment effect in the randomized trial. So I do my first observation, I get an outcome. Yeah, I'll get an estimate, like the maximum likelihood estimate will either be 0 or 1. And then I'll simulate another outcome, and that estimate will move quite a bit because to start with, I've got a limited amount of data. So every update, the estimate of the treatment effect will move a little bit. And actually you'll come to see this in the simulations that you're going to do. Yeah? Over time, because information goes like root n, the amount of information that you're gaining from every new recruit onto your randomized trial is providing you less and less information. And at some point, in just the same way if you were doing Markov chain Monte Carlo simulations, you will say we've converged and I'm going to stop my randomized trial at that point.
So it sounds like it's time to do the hands-on.
Yes.
And then we might ask more questions, but we first have lunch, and you are all invited. It's very nearby. We'll show you where. And at 12:30 there would be the mess, so we thought of getting downstairs a few minutes before the big mess downstairs. And we come back here at 2 p.m. and then we do the hands-on.
Do we need anything for the hands-on?
So, yeah, I guess Yeah, there's still a few things we could talk about, but anyway, there's a link to this has not just the practical stuff, but it also has the slides that we've
Oh, great. Thanks.
So yeah, I guess at some point, maybe at some point before lunch, if you maybe download it from that page, and then you can maybe have a look. And I don't know how much we can do in half an hour, but we'll maybe have a look do some of the aspects.
Okay, so now we have to find where the lunch is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.